Okay, I'll give a few remarks now. For people who are joining, these are just a few administrative remarks on the Stimson Center and other partner organizations. My name is Clint Work. I'm a fellow at the Stimson Center in 38 North. 38 North is a program of the Stimson Center, which is itself a nonpartisan policy research center in Washington, D.C. It was founded as a not-for-profit institution in 1989. And the Stimson Center is a nonpartisan think tank dedicated to enhancing global peace and economic prosperity by identifying pragmatic solutions to current and emerging global challenges. Initially focused on arms control, Stimson's research agenda has expanded to include a broad range of critical security issues focused around 4 key themes: protecting people, preserving the planet, promoting security and prosperity, and finally, grand strategy in pivotal places. The Stimson Center envisions a world in which the historical tendencies toward injustice, criminality, greed, and violence are defeated by the positive forces of peace and prosperity. And for attendees, I've shared in the chat box, which we've otherwise disabled, I've shared links for both the Stimson Center as well as 38 North. Stimson is constantly working to adapt to the new environment and runs various virtual programs like today's panel that are often open to public viewing. So please go to Stimson's website to check out future programming. And for more of a Korea focus, check out 38 North's website, where we post new and original commentary and analysis on a weekly basis. Also, in line with today's theme, today's panel theme, I've shared a link to a recent report which 38 North produced on the US-South Korea alliance, which focuses on certain key tensions and potential future scenarios. So I'd like to hand things over to my colleague and partner, Steve Lee, who will give some background on the Korea Defense Veterans Association.
Well, hello everyone from Potomac Falls, Virginia, in Northern Virginia. It's a beautiful day here, so very thankful to be a part of this wonderful seminar. The Korean Defense Veterans Association, or KDVA, is a nonprofit organization based in Virginia with a chapter in South Korea, or the Republic of Korea. Our membership is free, and we are open to US and South Korean veterans of the Korean War, as well as defense veterans. So millions of potential veterans could be members. Our mission is very simply to enhance the ROK, the South Korean US alliance, and to support the people who built the alliance, all of our veterans, as well as to continue, and those that continue to serve it. We have a website, kdva.vet, and about 22,000 Facebook followers. So lots going on. I'd just like to share with you that we are having a 2-part webinar on the 70th commemoration of the start of the Korean War. The first one is on the 25th of June, and this is wonderful opportunity for people to hear the great stories of our Korean War veterans and families on how the war affected them and why they think that is such a wonderful and important part of American life. Then on Friday, the 26th, we'll have another webinar that focuses more on how we can fulfill the Korean veterans' legacy of ensuring that this alliance continues to be an alliance for the ages that matters for both South Korea and the United States, and all the security and economic factors that go with that. So again, on behalf of the Korea Defense Veterans Association, really appreciate this opportunity to be here with you tonight. Clint.
Thank you, Steve. For attendees who are filing in, just to give you a heads up, we were just providing some background and some administrative remarks on our organizations, and now we're going to transition into the event itself. And to do so, I want to pass things over to Vaughn Shannon, who's the president of the Dayton Council on World Affairs.
All right, hello all. DCOWA members and regional friends, welcome to this online panel event entitled the US-South Korea Alliance Amidst Uncertainty, a collaboration of the Stimson Center and its 38 North Project, the American College of National Security Leaders, and the Korea Defense Veterans Association. I'm Vaughn Shannon, president of the Dayton Council on World Affairs. We at the DCOWA are glad to be co-sponsors and hosts to this prestigious panel event. We originally intended an in-person event in the spring at the Dayton Public Library downtown, but if 2020 has taught us anything, it is to expect anything. We are grateful to be able to pull off this online format so that DCOWA can continue its over 70-year mission of educating and engaging our local community with global programs. You can learn more about us at DCOWA.com, DCOWA.com. Speaking of 70 years, we approach the 70th anniversary of the start of the Korean War, a perfect time to reflect on where things stand on the peninsula and the broader East Asian theater, with issues that remain urgent, even if they are not current headline news with other things going on. So it is my pleasure to introduce the panel's moderator, Clint Work, who is a Stimson Center Fellow, who leads the program on congressional engagement on Korean peace and security issues. I know you will all join me in giving Clint and the panelists a warm welcome and our full attention for the next hour. Thank you.
Thank you, Vaughn, very much. And also thank you to DCOWA for partnering and helping organize and advertise what's a very, excuse me, a very timely discussion. And before I enter into my introductory remarks, I just want to extend my personal well wishes as well as those of Stimson and 38 North to all our attendees. This is a time of great uncertainty and unrest. So we hope that everybody and your families included are healthy and safe. We held a similar panel with the World Affairs Council of Kentucky and Southern India last Thursday. And both that and today's panel are part of what Vaughn alluded to at the outset, Stimson and 38 North's congressional outreach, and specifically our effort to engage a U.S. audience on Korea-related issues at the state and congressional district level. Both today and the previous webinar will be on Stimson's website soon for future viewing. And we will also conduct additional Korea-related webinars in partnership with other local organizations in coming months. Now, I noted in my opening remarks last week that COVID and the ongoing uncertainty surrounding it is really forcing us to rethink national security and also the importance of U.S. alliances as a crucial component to our national security. And I observed that among U.S. alliances, the U.S.-South Korea relationship is one of the most deeply institutionalized in the world. However, it's an unfortunate reality that Americans really pay little attention to the Korean Peninsula, and when they do, it's often through the lens of crisis and instability. But the importance of the relationship, and we really want to stress this today, with the Korean Peninsula and with South Korea in particular, extends beyond crisis or Kim Jong-un's nuclear stockpile or speculation about his health. Nevertheless, among Korea watchers, there's very real concern nowadays about the future direction of the U.S.-South Korea alliance and relations with North Korea. And the recent degradation of inter-Korean ties and more aggressive rhetoric from Pyongyang just this last weekend only intensifies this concern. However, it's very difficult for Americans to see why they should care about such issues. And in light of our own domestic unrest and a presidential election around the corner, people have even less attention to pay to it. So in the spirit of our local event, run in partnership with DCOWA, I thought I'd point to a few salient connections between Korea and Ohio. Of particular significance, as Vaughn alluded to, as we approach the 70th anniversary of the Korean War, are those who served. This includes 1,823 Ohioans who lost their lives during the war, and literally thousands of others who either served during the war or have been stationed in South Korea over the 7 decades since the war. Today, there are several important links between Korea and Dayton, Ohio, Ohio's 10th congressional district, and of course, the state of Ohio as a whole. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in the Dayton area is not only crucial to the local economy in Ohio, but also to U.S. national security and military commitments abroad. It provides extensive operational and acquisition support spanning the continental U.S., but also across the Pacific. The state of Ohio itself sends roughly $1.34 billion in exports to Korea, which account for nearly 8,000 jobs in the state of Ohio. And moreover, 2,000 Korean Americans call the 10th district their home, which makes up about 10% of the 22,600 Korean Americans throughout the entire state of Ohio. So put simply, while Korea may seem far away, there are multiple important links. And so in the spirit of that connection, and in an effort to bring you the voices of military officials and expert analysts with hands-on experience on and around the Korean Peninsula, we've organized our panel. And I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers. First is Major General Rick Martin, who joins us from the American College of National Security Leaders. Rick served 36 years in the U.S. Air Force as a commander, pilot, and a staff officer. And among many other important positions, he served at the Pentagon managing political military policy on the Korean Peninsula and as a delegate with the State Department during negotiations with North Korea. Alongside General Martin is Colonel Steve Lee. Steve is a Korea expert with over 20 years of experience working in Korea, the Pentagon, and the intelligence community, and is currently the Senior Vice President of the Korea Defense Veterans Association based in Northern Virginia. Steve has been interviewed on NBC's The Today Show and Fox News and has moderated and participated in numerous panels about the Us-Rok alliance. And you can go to KDVA's website to see some of those past programs. And lastly, my colleague and manager from the Stimson Center, Jenny Town. She's a Stimson Fellow and also the Deputy Director of Stimson's 38 North, which is a website devoted to providing policy and technical analysis on North Korea. In addition to her research, Jenny has experience in Track 2 diplomacy with North Korean officials and brings a wealth of insight to today's discussion. So just a few quick housekeeping matters. We're going to follow sort of an interview style conversation between myself and our panelists, and then we will turn to the audience for a Q&A at the midway point. And just a few quick notes on that. I want to thank attendees who sent questions ahead of time. We will likely answer most of those questions in our initial conversation, but I have queued up several other ones which we might not touch on in our conversation for our Q&A. And for other attendees, the Q&A box is currently open, so please feel free to enter your questions as we proceed through our conversation. But I do want to add sort of one request. Please make your questions as concise as possible. And as concise as possible, I mean 1 to 2 sentences. We will favor those that are more concise than the paragraph long questions. Also, if you do have a particular panelist in mind that you want to answer your question, please indicate as much when you ask it. Okay, now without further ado, I want to turn to our panelists and build on the theme of uncertainty, or building on the theme of uncertainty. And in light of North Korea's recent announcements and behavior towards both the US and South Korea, what is the current state of relations with North Korea, both US-DPRK relations and inter-Korean relations? And I might point to you, Jenny, and ask if you could kick us off.
Sure, thanks, Clinton. Thanks for having me here. I would say certainly relations are not good right now and are a far cry from the optimism that we had in 2018. But I would suggest that perhaps this whole process has been overly optimistic from the beginning. While it's good to create an air of excitement and possibility when starting a new negotiation, North Korea is such a hard case to begin with that expectation management is incredibly important as well. And neither Presidents Moon nor Trump have been good about providing realistic assessments of the situation. So for instance, Moon emerged from the Panmunjom summit in 2018 saying North Korea was going to denuclearize, the war was going to be finally declared over by the end of the year, and peace and prosperity were just around the corner. Trump came away from Singapore saying that the North Korean threat was over. But these obviously were not the actual outcomes of the summits themselves. And the more this messaging was over the top optimistic about what could be done and how quickly it could be done, the faster the frustration set in when the actual negotiation process was slow moving and getting hung up on where to start and how much was enough for a first deal. I think what we see now is a lot of frustration on all sides for essentially spending 2 years building up the expectation of big and easy wins, but with no side having much to show for it. And the North Koreans especially now are unwilling to continue negotiating with either the ROK or the US on the same terms. And so the barrage of statements coming out of Pyongyang over the last week, including the KPA statement that came out just before this event started, are of course very concerning. And it's difficult to assess which messages are serious threats, which ones may be posturing, and which ones may be North Korea's own attempt to demonstrate to a domestic audience that a failure of diplomacy to bring about quick and tangible results did not leave the state militarily weaker, as they struggle now both under heavy sanctions and the economic shocks associated with COVID-19 management. So I think the bottom line here is really that the prospects for renewed engagement in the near term are not good. And the more bellicose and belligerent behavior from the North Koreans that we see now is likely to continue into the near future. And given the domestic turmoil here in the US, ongoing tensions in the US-Rok alliance, ongoing tensions in ROK-Japan relations, and the rising tensions in US-China relations as well, this leaves the situation rife with uncertainty and really creates a lot of room for miscalculation. And so it's a troubling time right now.
Thank you, Jenny. Of course, predicting North Korea's behavior is never an easy thing to do, but the trajectory of events is not a positive one, as you indicated. Sticking with that theme of uncertainty and going further on something you mentioned, relations between Washington and Seoul, and what are key areas or points of tension in the US-Rok alliance. And I wanted to sort of turn to our other panelists and start with you, General Martin. What do you see as key points of tension currently in the US-South Korea relationship?
Thank you, Clint. Hello to everybody from San Antonio. Jenny, thank you for the rundown, kind of a scene setter on the uncertainty. I'm reminded that uncertainty has a perspective. It might be shared uncertainty, not just within the US-Rok alliance, but I think there's uncertainty within the North Korean leadership on what is going on. I think there's uncertainty within the allies. So all those come to play in this very, very important discussion about the US-Rok alliance. And a lot of factors impact that. I think certainly what is the shared threat condition and the status of that? What about influences from the region or areas that I would call alliance maintenance issues, cost sharing, special measures agreement, SMA, cost sharing within the alliance? I'd like just to spend a few moments on that because that's been in the news, not only with the US-Rok alliance, but also in NATO, and the US asking for more, posturing that there should be more contributions by members. And there's a lot of factors to consider here in the geopolitical scheme. They are stalled in Korea. It's worth noting that South Korea pays a great share of its own defense to the US presence on the order of about $1 billion. ROK's defense budget's about 2.5% of its own GDP, about $42 billion, give or take. That's more than most in NATO. The NATO standard's 2%, and most NATO countries do not do that. The average NATO country is about 1.5%. We know that Korea is a strong country, and they're a strong ally. They're the 10th largest military. And they've boosted their defense budget by 40% through the decade leading into 2017, and they increased it in 2019 by about 8%. Those are great puts and moves by South Korea. We'll get to the right result, I believe, through these negotiations. A couple key principles. I think they need to be incremental. I think we need to consider we need to consider for Korea costs on the peninsula, not the larger US military costs. It's what's happening on the peninsula. I think there might be a chance for South Korea to be creative in their contribution to the chemical defense equipment and training and other such ways that would be necessary on the peninsula. But I guess I would end with that the US military is not no military is a commercial enterprise or commodity. We can't determine alliance funding based on a balance sheet. And our men and women are not mercenaries. And I think those principles going forward are important to understand as we talk about cost sharing.
Thank you, Rick. Steve, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, sure. So aside from the specific areas of disagreement and being in a period of time where the alliance is, there's uncertainty and there's friction, quite honestly, I think the biggest issue is the overall US strategy and approach to alliances around the world. At a time when China is actively seeking to counter and undermine US influence and allies in the region, the US is taking a fragmentary view of alliances in East Asia. China's advantage, well known that they're physically there, literally in the middle of the region, and they've been there for thousands of years and have thousands of year history with and relationships with the countries in the area. So dangerous when you consider that they have a policy of mobilizing all in parts of their national power to try to disrupt our alliances and US influence in the region. But the US also has advantages, and we have a huge one, and that's the long-standing and important alliances, especially in that area. So in a macro sense, I think the US needs to do a better job of working with the allies and partners in the region. Otherwise, quite simply, we will lose ground to China and weaken our readiness and deterrence against threats like North Korea. Over to you, Clint.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Sorry, I was fiddling with my mute button. You have direct experience, Steve, on the peninsula and some of the institutions. So I might just ask a quick follow-up about this. One of the benefits, and you cited it, these are pre-existing alliances. They've been there for a while. They're well institutionalized. Could you comment on the existing institutional structure of the alliance and ways that it can help adjudicate some of the tensions or frictions that you mentioned existing?
Yeah. So it gets a little confusing in that the US four-star general, who is currently in Korea, wears three significant titles. The first one is as the commander of the United Nations Command. The United Nations Command was created by a UN Security Council resolution back at the start of the Korean War. 22 nations provided either combat forces or humanitarian assistance. And 17 are still there standing with South Korea against North Korean threat every day. And the United States is one of those countries. And the United Nations Command's main job is to maintain the armistice agreement, which simply means stability for that part of the world. The United States and South Korea have this organization that is called the Combined Forces Command. They're two countries, and their main purpose is to deter and defend, if necessary, against any North Korean attack. Making up the main forces of Combined Forces Command is the United States Forces Korea, our 28,500 folks that are there, standing ready, shoulder to shoulder with the South Korean military and the South Korean Joint Chiefs of Staff. Each country provides support to the Combined Forces Command should anything happen on the Korean Peninsula that triggers a crisis and our operational plans to go to war. So between the United States and South Korea, there's several mechanisms to ensure that we work together. One is called the Military Committee Meeting, which is a chairman level meeting, and the Security Consultative Meeting, which is a Secretary of Defense level meeting. South Korea is the only country that the United States does this annual meeting with. And oh, by the way, even though it's an annual meeting, when there is a crisis at any time, any of our chairmen can reach out to their counterpart, and our secretaries can as well, and invoke this MCM and SCM to make sure that we're talking about the same things, looking at the same pictures, and trying to figure out what actions and no actions to take if necessary. So the United Nations Command continues to provide stability in the region. The South Korean-US alliance continues to deter North Korean aggression and is always ready to defend. And the alliance carries out its mission with several crisis-tested plans and actions.
Thank you, Steve. And all of you have alluded to this in various ways, but thinking about the future of the alliance, what are some of the implications of these issues moving forward? Not only in terms of military considerations on the Korean Peninsula, but for the broader strategic environment in the region. And second, why should this matter to ordinary Americans? And I might turn to Major General Martin.
Thank you, Clint. Regarding the broader perspective, I think an approach that we need to be thinking about is what I call the 3D approach, which is diplomacy, development, and defense. in that order. The military should be used as a last resort. The alliance needs to be strong and provide that foundation that really enables each of the other components there. But diplomacy needs to be front and center with options for doors to diplomacy with the North and with the region. That's key. State Department also has a development capability as well through the USAID, Agency for International Development, and that's been key around the world. I think that's key here. How can we use their expertise to help the situation on the peninsula? So diplomacy, then development, then finally defense as a last resort, an important one here. Maintaining economic sanctions are key on the peninsula, as well as opportunities for diplomacy while maintaining a strong alliance. Those are critical there. When we think about why it's important to the common person on the street, the American, I think clearly, as you highlighted earlier, shared economic ties, shared history, the least of which is a military history. There are a few places in the world that will bring a challenge not only to the alliance, but to the world. Korea is one of them. What happens on the streets of America, streets in America needs to resonate in Congress. And I think there's an education piece here that we're talking about on this webinar, and that's key for what's happening in Korea as well. We want to stay in good communication and cooperation, consultation on all things Korea, particularly with our partner, the Republic of Korea. And we want to stay left of the crisis, left of bang. So I think those are key reasons why the average American cares about Korea and why that region is important.
Thank you, Rick. Jenny, can I turn to you now?
Yeah, thanks. I agree with what General Martin said. And to bring it a little closer to home even, and Clint, you alluded to this in your opening remarks, is I think we have to remember that having good relations with Korea is more than just the military relationship itself. You know, there's a lot of trade and economics that goes on. And I think we've already seen with the implications of recent trade actions and trade restrictions with China, with Japan even going on tariffs, and Korea as well. And as well as then seeing how dependent we are and interdependent we are on the economic side of the equation through what's happened with COVID-19. So as those supply chains have broken down, it's caused enormous disruptions, global disruptions in supply chains and really hardships on the economic side of the front. So I think we need to think about too, if relations start to deteriorate within the alliance and actions are becoming more common, such as trade restrictions and tariffs and trade wars, this can have huge implications for local economies as well. And so it's not just an over there issue. It is one that has real implications for people here.
Thank you, Jenny. And Steve, could you bring up the rear?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of what's ahead, if there is ever a military crisis on the Korean Peninsula, you know, my biggest point to our audience out there is really don't worry too much about it, in that the alliance, specifically our military command in Korea, they've got it. Crisis management is something that they work on continuously. We've been working together as an alliance, training together, and we're experienced over decades. So in the event of crisis or something that you hear on the Korean Peninsula, even over the weekend, just please understand that our military organizations in South Korea clearly have it. To the point about you know, why should this matter to people in the United States? Let me just, I've shown this before, and it's a slide that just says, hey, in the United States, there's so many things that make up our relationship with South Korea, and it's on all fronts. And as you can see from this slide, South Korea is lit up. You've seen it before, and that is because South Korean people are just done tremendous work since the Korean War. And North Korea, they're a failure, and you can clearly see that. And one of the biggest reasons why South Korea is a success that it is because its alliance has been so successful. And we should all be very proud of that as Americans. You know, one of the things you don't want to know is is that brands like Hyundai and people have LG and Samsung TVs at home. Well, yeah, that stuff matters, right? And that's directly linked to the ROK-US alliance and the stability and the great prosperity that they provide.
Thank you, Steve. I have a whole group of additional questions, but I want to turn towards our audience Q&A. And so we also have an abundance of questions from them. And I want to turn to none other than General Vincent Brooks, who was, I think our attendees may know, the former four-star commander of US and allied forces on the peninsula, with whom I know our panelists are familiar. And I will say, General Brooks, he broke my rule of asking a question that's more than 1 to 2 sentences, but in his case, I'm going to make an exception. So he writes, thank you, Jenny and Rick, for sharing your insights today. And Steve, I'm sure you as well. Given the recent bellicose rhetoric and demonstrated military posturing announced today, refortifying outposts on the DMZ outpost line, is it possible that North Korea is posturing to show strength when in fact they are weakened, trying to draw the ROK and possibly the US also to the negotiating table to release sanctions and declare an end of hostilities? How can the US and ROK avoid a miscalculation by seeing only the bellicosity while not sensing the opposite? In other words, the desire for dialogue.
Clint, thank you. Can you hear me? And thanks to General Brooks. It's good to hear him, good to have him on board here. He and Carol are dear friends, and I salute his service and any of those listening here that are invested in this very important topic here. Great questions. I think it gets to what General Brooks often talked about. That was the sacred trust. That's a two-way trust. It goes two-way within the alliance and certainly trust in the North-South dialogue. And I credit General Brooks for just bringing that front and center. Very key. And that gets right to the heart of what I call C2, not military C2 like command and control, but communication and cooperation. And it's those points of diplomacy, the doors to diplomacy, to have dialogue, to build trust, to understand each other's intent. Because it very well may be that North Korea is in a tough situation, or people have argued they might even be in an existential existence, and the health of Kim Jong-un and the potential succession is a great, great concern. And they probably have some uncertainty themselves. So how can we collectively help and build that trust and increase that communication and education here back in the States?
Thank you, Rick. Jenny, did I see?
Thanks, Clint, and thanks, General Brooks, for your question. It's a very important one. And I think we have to be very careful about reading these statements. Who is it coming from? Who is the intended audience? What are they really saying? And the KPA statement that came out just this afternoon was really interesting in the fact that it echoed, some of the rhetoric that Kim Yo-jong said yesterday or earlier today. It's hard to keep track anymore. But it also had a formulation at the end where it talked mainly about how it was now tasked to put together ideas to present for approval. And we saw this formulation back in 2017 as well, when North Korea talked about putting together military options that would be geared towards Guam. And Western media especially went crazy about this, reporting, oh, North Korea is planning to bomb Guam. And that's not what the KPA said. The KPA said they were drafting up plans that would be put forth for consideration. And I think we see this formula today as, again, this, here are the options, here are the areas they listed as potential that seem to be targeting specifically the things that were in the Comprehensive Military Agreement, just to emphasize that the cooperation is considered over. But, you know, still leaving that out. They're not saying they're doing it now. They're creating the opportunity for that decision to still be made. And so I think we shouldn't overreact to what they said, and I think we should still be ready for actions to be taken, but consider the options of, you know, let's wait and see what comes next, but still be prepared for you know, some kind of provocation to take place.
Steve, would you like to respond as well?
Sure. The strategy should just continue to be pressure on North Korea as well as engagement. Pressure, you have to do that with North Korea because, as panelists talked about, you can't really trust them. Okay, and until there is a trust built in that is actionable and you see, you've got to make sure that deterrence is there, make sure that the readiness is there to make sure that North Korean provocations or actions don't go too far, and of course the sanctions, because they do work in trying to pressure them into negotiations. And the dialogue has to be open at all times. The United Nations Command helps to maintain the demilitarized zone on our side. And we have a dialogue mechanism in place under the armistice agreement so that whenever there is anything unusual that happens, like on guard posts, we have a mechanism that the United Nations Command can talk to the North Koreans at all times, and it's manned 24 hours a day. So the mechanisms that are already in place, we just need to continue to use both pressure and engagement for.
Thank you, Steve. I know Jenny has a quick follow-up on that.
Yeah, and like General Brooks alluded to too, as well as, I think we have to think about what's happening in North Korea now. And I think some of this is really geared towards instilling some confidence in the North Korean people that despite, again, 2 years of negotiations that didn't bring about quick results, and the economic shocks of COVID-19, there are a lot of issues that North Korea is dealing with right now. All the hoo-ha about the absence of Kim Jong-un, and so I think there's a bit of in the why now factor is some of it is geared towards, now that they're coming out of COVID-19, trying to message that they're still a strong country, trying to instill confidence and leadership that they can get through this era. As well as, I think now with Moon Jae-in and the recent election with his party getting the majority, I think there's been a lot of, again, over-the-top rhetoric coming from South Korea about all these grand plans that they have that involve North Korean cooperation. And I think the North Koreans, again, are saying, hey, wait a minute. You know, it's one thing to talk about future plans, but so far you haven't delivered on what you've already promised. So at some level, the terms of those negotiations does have to change. And I think South Korea really needs to also be very careful about how it portrays the situation going forward.
Steve, you mentioned armistice conditions and the UN command or UNC a second ago. I wanted to turn to a question that digs into that a little bit. This is from Dan Pinkston, who is joining us from Freedom's Frontier itself. And he writes, if Korea Command stands up and replaces the CFC in a case of operational control transfer, and the new command structure has an ROK commander, what happens to the UNC? The UNC commander, of course, is responsible for upholding the armistice and is an American. Could a transfer of operational control cause problems, or what problems could this cause or create for unity of command, particularly in a scenario that you sort of outlined, Steve? If there's a crisis, could there be a mismatch or disunity in command?
First of all, when there is a change of wartime operational control from the US 4-star general to a South Korean 4-star general, that's currently being tested and planned for. It basically just means that the commander goes from a US to a South Korean. It's almost like a change of command, if you will. They still have to go through the same consultative mechanisms that we talked about with the military committee and the security consultative, as well as all the way up to our national command authorities. So that part of it does not change. And as I explained, the United Nations Command's mission is upholding the armistice agreement and providing stability. That part of the command and hat, the US 4-star will retain. Some people in South Korea think, hey, once this wartime operational control happens and the South Korean takes over, hey, the United Nations Command should just go away. No, again, that was established and its mission is still critical until a peace settlement is done by the belligerents, okay? So I think it's great that Combined Forces Command will eventually be led by a 4-star South Korean general. And the United Nations Command will continue to provide stability through the armistice agreement until both sides decide on a peace treaty.
Thank you, Steve. I want to turn now to a question that we were sent ahead of time before the panel a few days ago, which talks a little bit about the U.S. force presence and what could happen were it removed. And the question, the person posing the question wrote, I understand China's involvement in North Korea as they share an important border. What is the justification for the United States' continued involvement on the Korean Peninsula? Since the collapse of the domino theory and the failure of the Vietnam War, what is a good justification for the U.S. still to be involved in Asian affairs? If the U.S. were to exit the Korean Peninsula, what do you as experts expect to happen? General Martin, could you respond first?
Sure. I think great question about the geopolitics and the importance of the region. I think the alliance gets right to the heart of that. I think what happened in the failure of the Vietnam War may be a little apples and oranges here when it comes to the Korean Peninsula, but there's no question that we will still be involved in Asian affairs given the geopolitics, the importance of that region, the importance of the Indo-Pacific region to a U.S. and world security and stability. So I think that is a key part of what we're talking about here when it comes to U.S. involvement on the Korean Peninsula. Again, consultation and communication is very important here so that the messaging is correct, both to our allied partners, but also with the Chinese and with the North Koreans or Russians. That will be key here going forward. I think that sacred trust that General Brooks talks about is key here, and these communication opportunities and education all lead to a better understanding of the Korean Peninsula and in this very important area of the Indo-Pacific region.
Thank you, General Martin. Jenny or Steve, do I see a two-finger intervention to respond to what do you think would happen if U.S. forces were indeed removed from the Korean Peninsula? Steve, would you like to? I see Jenny waving. The wave is more forceful than the two-finger.
It's obviously it's a good question and something that the South Koreans have grappled with for a long time, and it's something that I think that there is no consensus view on do they need the U.S. still there? Do they want the U.S. still there? And this has been an ongoing fight for decades as South Korea's own defenses grow, as they want to, as there's times when it's clear that the interests of the U.S. and the South Korea are not always aligned. The priorities are not always aligned. And I think we've seen this over the past couple of years where South Korea wants to move very quickly forward with the North Koreans. The U.S. is very reluctant to move without substantive moves from the North Koreans. And so that pacing has been off, and I think has caused a lot of resentment in Seoul as well, with this feeling that the U.S. has been standing in their way. But I think when the optimism again was high that that the relationship between the two Koreas was going to change and change in a fundamental and sustainable way, there were a lot of questions about, well, then what does that mean for the alliance? Does the alliance need to be continued? Does it need to be reconfigured? How can it better suit both parties' interests in the future? But there is still plenty of skepticism in South Korea and plenty of worry in South Korea that if the US were to pull out completely, does that open the door for North Korean military adventurism to pick up? And I think that's always the biggest fear, is how much of a deterrent factor is the US troops there in and of themselves?
Such an open question that policymakers haven't wanted to test it by removing them, at least in years past. Steve, would you like to add to that?
No, I mean, I think everyone pretty much made the major points. From a military guy who's worked 6 years in the command, 13 years on the peninsula, to me, it's just simply that if the United States pulls out of South Korea, there's just too much risk of a country that you cannot trust in North Korea to take advantage of that. And at the end of the day, I just don't think it's worth that risk. And there's no other way that we can mitigate that risk for South Korea and for U.S. interests in that part of the country. As we talked about before, when I showed you that slide, I mean, just so interwoven with common shared values, our economies, our people-to-people connections between the two countries, South Korea and the United States, that that's why it matters in just so many ways. That to me, any talk of bringing back our soldiers from South Korea without North Korean military threat first going away, I think is just way too risky for U.S. interests.
I see, Rick.
Yeah, Clint, if I may just add to these comments, I think the importance of interoperability here with our countries is a foundation here that we're talking about. And we do have a strong interoperable force, and together with the ROK. And if we're going to talk about force reductions, it can be done, but in a very phased, deliberate, intentional fashion with a lot of checks and balances, with a trust but verify approach. And those are worthy conversations to have, because we want to be prepared. And one thing the military does well is to think through, strategize, and plan. And so that would be a positive step to be able to do that, to have these plans in place for that eventuality.
Thank you, General Martin. So we have a question here, which is something we wanted to touch on in a previous panel, but didn't get to. So I wanted to highlight this, and this is for all the panelists. Please comment on whether the credibility of the U.S. extended deterrence capability contributes to the stress or uncertainty in the alliance. Does the U.S. extended deterrence commitment contribute to stress or uncertainty in the alliance? Jenny?
I'll go first. And I'm sure the generals have more comments. I do think there is a part of it that does contribute to stresses in the region, especially if it's posed in a way where the US is insisting that South Korea take sides and want South Korea to do more than what South Korea is comfortable with in terms of integrating, especially like missile defenses, and taking actions that would jeopardize or antagonize their relations, especially with China. So, South Korea is obviously in a very fragile geopolitical position and has, a fair amount of economic dependency on the Chinese economy. And so, whenever they're kind of forced into that decision, they've already seen once now with the whole reactions to the deployment of THAAD, of the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System, when China imposed trade sanctions on South Korea for implementing this, And the US wasn't there to help them and defend them and help mitigate those effects. As a allied partner, I think it really called into question for the South Koreans what the cost of the alliance is in terms of their geopolitical standing. And I think it does create tensions that are underappreciated on the US side.
Thank you, Jenny. Rick.
Yeah, that's accurate, Jenny. I think one thing, the U.S. will be there. We've demonstrated that. The ROK, the alliance is strong. You can count on U.S. capabilities. But it gets confusing if there are other factors involved that we talked about earlier, some of the defense sharing agreements, some alliance maintenance issues, and the like. But I think three considerations that are key to extended deterrence is both, number one, a mutual commitment, and then clarity on what is being deterred, shared understanding of the threat. And then to have the capability forward. And it's not just a capability, it's a capacity as well. Capability is a term of art for the military. The capacity is to be able to do it again and again and show that commitment to extended longer term. And then thirdly, a clear understanding of what is expected of the allied partners here when it gets to the mutual defense treaty here. Especially if threatened by a third party. And I think we can rest assured the U.S. is going to be part of that. I think there's some discussion maybe on the administrative control areas around the Pacific and what does Article 3 of the Defense Treaty talk about there. But I think I would end with the U.S. Is going to be there to support a contingency on the peninsula.
Steve, would you like to add?
Sure. I think the big point is that the extended deterrence is a crucial element of our overall deterrence strategy against North Korea, and it works. You know, North Korea knows that the U.S. is there, and South Korean military modernized much better than theirs overall in conventional forces. But what do they really fear? And that is our deterrence strategic capabilities. Okay, they know that. They know what we did in previous wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. They know what our arsenals are. They get nervous whenever we fly strategic assets to the Korean Peninsula. There's a reason for that. Okay, and so extended deterrence, absolutely important for both the United States and South Korea. And yes, there are times when we have to massage how other countries like China react to how we use and deploy extended deterrence capabilities. But in terms of the cost and benefits analysis, clearly a benefit.
Thank you, Steve. Continuing on looking at the larger regional setting, we have a question. Considering the U.S. shift towards great power competition with China and Russia, as outlined in the 2018 National Defense Strategy, how will the US-ROK alliance be affected by this shift to great power competition? And also, how will this affect a potential deprioritization of the North Korean threat? Could it lead to a deprioritization of the North Korean threat if the focus is more on the great power competition? Jenny, you want to take this up?
Well, the second part of the question, for sure, you know, I think it will lead, it certainly can lead to a deprioritization of North Korea when it comes to what US considers its strategic priorities. Obviously, China is the bigger priority if tensions, and especially now as tensions are rising. But I think it also creates a much more complex picture of how to deal with North Korea when you don't have a mechanism for cooperation between the big powers. And so what you saw, for instance, in 2017 was a general consensus that North Korea had stepped beyond, had stepped over the line, right? And so there was a sort of a collective agreement that punitive measures had to be taken in order to try and change this behavior. The more you have rising tensions between US, China, US, Russia, the less agreement and less cooperation you're going to have on dealing with issues like North Korea, which again will put South Korea in a very precarious space, and presumably Japan as well. So I think it's, it's certainly not helpful to maintaining stability in the region. The more we try to exacerbate, and more that we emphasize the strategic competition rather than strategic cooperation.
Steve or Rick, would you have anything to add on how this increasing great power competition could affect priorities or the alliance itself?
Just a few comments, Clint. I think it talks to the importance of an alliance that is more, not what the U.S. does for Korea, but what we do together. Number one. Number two, I think it talks to the importance of a consistent, coherent policy coming out of DC. That's important, and messaging and making sure that our policies are understood and communicated and consulted. Number three, I think it talks to the importance of experts and positions of government, particularly in the U.S., and being sure that we've got North Korean experts and Asian experts in state, in the NSC, in our key military positions, and then that continuity of expertise going forward.
And I would just comment again the importance of the United States recognizing its allies in that region. We're already built in with a lot of history and a lot of different mechanisms, both through official government channels as well as people to people and through our economy. The importance of working together with Japan, specifically in South Korea. And then even within the allies, things like between South Korea and Japan, JSOMIA, the General Security of Military Information Agreement, okay? The Free and Open Indo-Pacific Initiative. There is some leverage that even South Korea has if they decide that they would like to do more as a alliance, so that we stand firm against any kinds of adventurism between from China or Russia.
Thank you, Stephen. Just one final question, and our panelists will have to be quick in their response, but I think it's apropos some of what you just said. This was sent ahead of time. Does the transition between a Democrat and Republican administration in the White House affect US-ROK relations, or is US foreign policy towards South Korea steady because of its geostrategic position in the region? An important question considering the upcoming presidential election. Any of the panelists want to hazard a rapid fire response? I see Jenny.
I think that if Trump is reelected, I think it will call the South Koreans into asking a lot of really important questions about the alliance if he continues treating the alliances the way that he has in his first term. I would assume and I would hope that if a Democrat were elected, that they would go back to a much more traditional stance on alliances and work to repair some of the damage that has been done in this first term in the alliance relations.
Steve or Rick?
I just would like to separate the politics from a military alliance. We're military members dedicated to the defense and the alliance. And I think we have to weather that, the changes of political administrations. The alliance is strong. We're ready to fight tonight. We go together. Kapchi, kapchi da.
So another aspect of this is North Korea. When we saw President Trump start engaging North Korea, I think it made Kim Jong-un nervous because he'd never seen a U.S. leader act and say the things that he did. Okay, and so it threw him off. It threw him off their basic playbook of how to deal with the United States. And so if a Democrat is brought back into the White House in November, I think the North Koreans are going to reassess and go, okay, should we go back to the old playbook before Trump to see if that's going to work? Or do we try to figure out something totally different? And regardless of what North Korea decides to do, like General Martin said, our part for the alliance is just to make sure that we're strong and we continue to consult and just make sure that North Korea understands that any kind of adventurism is not going to work on the Korean Peninsula.
Thank you to all our panelists in responding quickly to that. I want to apologize to those questions we didn't address. This always happens. It's such a complex issue. There are many, many questions we just can't get to. Hopefully we touched on most of them though. And I want to give our panelists an opportunity to make some closing remarks, some closing thoughts on the panel. So General Martin, I'll turn to you first.
Thank you, Clint. I will keep my comments brief here. One, to DCOWA, thank you for the opportunity here to engage this audience and talk about this very important part of the world and this important alliance here. There's no more important geopolitical part of the world. The ROK Alliance is a key facet of security and stability, and better discussing these issues now than during a crisis. I'd also like to highlight the role of your local there, the local area in Dayton, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and each of you that are involved with the presence and missions at that base. If there's science and technology going on in our Air Force or military, Wright-Pat is involved. And so thank you for all that you do there. And thank you to the veterans that you highlighted, Clint, both at the families of lost ones from the Korean War, members who have served there, the 3.3 million veterans, some of whom are on the webinar now. Their dedication and service and sacrifice, I salute as we honor the 70th anniversary of this conflict.
Steve?
So really appreciate this opportunity to participate in this forum. I think it's just absolutely vital that people who are interested in South Korea and the United States' relationship with South Korea get an opportunity to hear from our distinguished panel here. The Korea Defense Veterans Association, we really appreciate the opportunity to partner and be a part of this in advancing the understanding and the advocacy for this irreplaceable alliance. It really is. When you think about it, there's nothing like it and there's nothing that can replace it. So thank you for that. Thank you, Clint, for moderating and putting this together. I look forward to having more opportunities like this. Vaughn, thank you very much. And finally, really, as stated before, especially on the 70th commemoration of the start of the Korean War on the 25th of June, I would just encourage everyone out there to please reflect on it. We're only about 2 weeks out from that terrible day when the war started, and remember our veterans and their families. So thank you very much.
Jenny?
And I would just like to echo the sentiments of my colleagues, and thank you to World Affairs Council, Vaughn, and to Clint for moderating the panel today. I think it's important to keep in mind that what happens on the Korean Peninsula has great strategic importance to us at home, both in maintaining our credibility as a strategic ally, as well as in promoting strategic balance and security in the region. I think finally, as everyone has mentioned, as we near the 70th anniversary of the Korean War, I want to echo my colleagues in thanking all of the troops for their service. And I hope we all work to make sure that their service and sacrifice will never be forgotten and hopefully never be repeated again.
And in closing, again, I echo really everything that was just said. And I think the upcoming anniversary, I know that the upcoming anniversary of the 70th anniversary of the Korean War really puts what we're trying to do today in stark relief. The truth is the Korean Peninsula has always been crucial to U.S. national security from the earliest days of the Cold War, and it's even more so today, and it's only going to increase in importance. And so hopefully, sort of in the shadow and in honor of that anniversary, we can put into focus why we never want to see a return to such a conflict. And it's events like this that try to help us spread awareness of the Korean Peninsula and encourage our attendees to stay keyed in on these issues and to communicate with their own representatives accordingly when it comes to the importance of this to not just the Korean people, but to the American people as well. So thank you again to DCOWA and to Vaughn for helping organize this panel, and all the best to my fellow panelists and of course to all our attendees.